Donald Trump thought he could crush Canada with a simple tariff, but instead, he ignited a food supply crisis that exposed one of America's most embarrassing vulnerabilities and revealed the unlikely weapon Canada used to fight back: French fries. This story is not really about potatoes. It is about what happens when political theater collides with the brutal mathematics of modern supply chains, and how a seemingly minor trade dispute became a case study in who actually understands power in the 21st century. There were three tipping points that transformed a small tariff into a strategic disaster for the United States. The first came the moment the tariff was announced. The second unfolded inside processing plants across America, as companies scrambled for alternatives that did not exist. But the third tipping point was decisive, because it was there that Canada proved it had been preparing for this moment for years. Picture it clearly. A 25% tariff imposed overnight on Canadian potato products, no negotiations, no gradual transition, just an abrupt declaration designed to project American strength and Canadian weakness. The assumption in Washington was simple. Canada needs American buyers more than America needs Canadian potatoes. Apply enough pressure, and Canada will bend. What actually happened shattered that logic. Within days, shipments from Prince Edward Island slowed to a trickle. American food processors who had spent decades building relationships with Canadian growers suddenly found their storage facilities empty. Restaurants dependent on consistent frozen potato supplies watched costs spike overnight, and the American agricultural system was forced to confront a reality it had long ignored. You cannot replace an integrated supply chain with a press conference. The tariff was not a demonstration of strength, it was a revelation of weakness, because power in modern trade does not come from the ability to impose costs, it comes from the ability to absorb them. In this case, Canada was prepared to absorb the shock, and America was not. What Washington failed to understand was that Prince Edward Island farmers were part of a system built over generations. Cold storage networks, processing facilities calibrated to exact specifications, transportation corridors running on tight schedules, and multi-year contracts with buyers who valued predictability above all else. When you disrupt a system like that without building an alternative, you do not create leverage, you create chaos. To understand what that chaos looks like in real life, consider three people. First is Robert, a third-generation potato farmer on Prince Edward Island. His family has been growing potatoes since the 1960s, refining techniques and building relationships with American processors who prized consistency. When the tariff hit, Robert did not panic, because he understood something Washington did not. His potatoes were not a generic commodity. They were the product of specific soil conditions, climate patterns, and generational knowledge that could not be replicated overnight. Instead of absorbing the tariff costs, Robert made calls to buyers in Japan, activated contracts with processors in South Korea, and explored markets in China, where a growing middle class was developing a taste for frozen convenience foods. Within weeks, his potatoes were moving west across the Pacific instead of south across the border. He made that pivot because his business required stability, and America had just announced it could no longer provide it. The second person is Jennifer, a restaurant owner in Idaho whose diners built their reputation on quality food at reasonable prices. French fries were a staple of her menu. For years, she sourced frozen potato products from processors dependent on Canadian supply. Consistent quality, predictable pricing. When the tariff hit, her costs jumped by 25%. Alternative suppliers were either unavailable or inconsistent in quality. She tried switching to American-grown potatoes and learned what every food service operator eventually learns. Not all potatoes are equal. Different growing conditions produce different frying characteristics, and customers noticed immediately. Jennifer found herself trapped between absorbing costs that would destroy her margins or passing them on to customers who would simply go elsewhere. She was not fighting ideology, she was fighting mathematics, and mathematics does not care about political. The third person is David, a processing plant manager in Maine, whose facility employs 300 workers. For 20 years, his plant relied on Canadian potatoes because they arrived with clockwork consistency, disease-resistant varieties, proper storage, reliable transportation, messaging. The entire operation was calibrated around that predictability. When the tariff disrupted supply, David scrambled to find alternatives. He contacted American growers and quickly discovered the uncomfortable truth: you cannot conjure agricultural capacity out of thin air. Growing potatoes requires specific soil and climate expertise. Processing them requires equipment calibrated to particular varieties, and quality control systems take years to develop. David faced a stark choice: shut down production lines and lay off workers, or find new suppliers. He chose the latter. But those suppliers were not in America. They were in Canada, selling to processors in Asia. Three people, one shared reality. When political decisions ignore institutional complexity, ordinary people pay the price. That was the first tipping point. The moment the tariff was announced, Canadian growers activated contingency plans, developed over years of watching American trade policy grow increasingly unpredictable. They signed long-term contracts with Asian buyers, invested in processing capacity oriented toward stable markets, and positioned themselves to survive without American demand. This was not improvisation. It was preparation, meeting, opportunity. Meanwhile, American processors confronted a hard truth: interdependence runs both ways. Building alternatives takes time, capital, and expertise you may not have. The food service industry operates on assumptions of stability, and when those assumptions collapse, the system does not smoothly adjust, it lurches. The second tipping point emerged when American industry groups began pressuring Washington to reverse course, not because they felt sentimental about Canadian potatoes, but because they understood what policymakers had failed to grasp. Supply chains are not political stage props. They are complex systems built on trust, consistency, and decades of relationships. Lobbyists descended on Capitol Hill with a blunt message: this tariff is costing us more than it is costing Canada. Our prices are rising, our workers' jobs are at risk, and the leverage we were supposed to gain does not exist because Canada has already found other buyers, while we cannot find alternative suppliers at the quality and scale we require. Imagine a conference room in Washington filled with food industry executives, agricultural representatives, and processing plant managers, all staring at projections that tell the same story. American potato production cannot rapidly scale to replace Canadian imports. Someone suggests negotiating with Canada. Another points out that Canada is already negotiating with Asia. And then a third voice asks the question no one wants to answer: what if we have made ourselves irrelevant to Canadian agriculture by proving that we are an unreliable partner